Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Amira Hass, who is a correspondent for Haaretz newspaper in Israel. Her publications include Drinking the Sea at Gaza and a collection of articles entitled Reporting from Ramallah, an Israeli Journalist in Occupied Land. She is a recipient of numerous human rights and journalism awards, including the Bruno Kreisky Human Rights Award and in 2003, the UNESCO Press Freedom Award. Amira, welcome to Berkeley.
Good morning.
Where were you born?
Jerusalem, Israel.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
They were Jewish Holocaust survivors, members of the Israeli Communist Party. My mother had been a partisan in Yugoslavia against German occupation, but then she was deported to a concentration camp. My father was in a ghetto. And I think I was raised in this, in their personal attempt, an ideological attempt to compensate for the terrible emotional and ideological vacuum and family vacuum created after the Second World War, with the loss of most of their family and friends and people and history and life. To compensate this with the hope that you can work on for a better world where equality, the principle of equality is recognized as a basic for human life.
In reading the introduction to your book, Drinking the Sea at Gaza, you talk about your family, and I get the sense of both a legacy of loss, of looking back, but also of resistance. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, only that the loss is not that you look back and you feel the loss. The loss is always there. You don't have to look back to feel the loss. It's in everyday's life. If your brothers and sisters and other beloved ones have all been murdered by the Nazi system, then the loss is ever present. Mm-hmm. But yes.
And your mother was a writer. She actually had a diary about.
That's right.
Tell us a little about that.
She wrote a diary in the concentration camp, which was already a death penalty if she was found writing it. Her friends or the other inmates in the barrack were covering for her when she was writing. She wrote on pieces of paper that she found who knows where. And actually she described life there. She didn't talk so much about herself. She made kind of analysis of what was happening to people around her. She was also teaching children, and it was another forbidden activity for inmates in this concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen. And she taught children because she felt that they needed to be taken care of in this hell. But it was, for her, it was like a way of fighting, for sure, to have these both forbidden activities.
Where were you educated?
Jerusalem and then Tel Aviv.
And what university? You went to the university?
So I went to Hebrew University and then Tel Aviv University, but I was stuck with my MA studies. So.
Mm-hmm. and what first you did some human rights work, but then you became a journalist.
When I was already working for Haaretz as a text editor, I needed something for my neshama, as you say in Hebrew, for my soul, and I volunteered. It was in the middle of the first Intifada. I volunteered in a group called Workers' Hotline. We assisted Palestinian workers mainly, whose rights were violated by Israeli employers, and they were not represented properly by the Israeli trade union. So we started this advocacy group, and also active assistance in the sense of approaching employers and either through lawyers or directly in order to get for these people what they deserved.
And is this where you first developed your consciousness of the plight of the Palestinians?
No,
or is it goes back
yes,
further?
It goes look, I grew up in a political family and political surrounding. I've never, I was active in the Israeli left wing for years. So occupation, I mean, I've been involved in acts against occupation, but I always thought that our activity should be in the Israeli street with Israelis, and to explain to them and to try and promote the understanding that occupation is wrong. For this, I did not need to go and meet with or experience Palestinian occupation. But there was a change with the first Intifada that I felt that all this kind of political activism led nowhere. And with this activity of mine with Workers' Hotline, I came to know Gaza especially, and it was like discovering a new world, because, you know, I didn't have prejudice, I think, but I didn't have much knowledge about ordinary life there. More theoretical knowledge I had. So it was an opportunity to have more detailed knowledge, and I was fascinated by people in the society. I found it a very, very warm society, very welcoming society, very resilient society.
So let's talk, before we talk about the occupation and the suicide bombers, let's talk a little about the way you see your craft, the methodology you use, and so on. You, in your work, have actually gone to live in the communities that you write about. Tell us about that and that choice of as a way to do your craft as a journalist. Yeah.
I think it's so natural, you know, for a journalist to do so. If I were asked to cover French affairs, I would go and live in Paris, I guess, and travel a lot in France, not write about France from Germany. So this is the basic, I think, in journalistic work, in this sort of journalistic work. Then also, I guess I have this maybe research curiosity, which I could satisfy by living there, because what it is an ongoing research. So I'm very lucky. I discover a new society. I discover all kinds of facets of this society by living in it, but still by being some sort of an observer. I'm not part of the society in the real sense of the word. Of course, you become sort of, but I'm always in this position, and it's interesting, this position of observant while you live in the society. So it is, some have compared my work with anthropological work, maybe more progressive anthropological work, not the. So this for me has been, I think, very important also personally. I do have an obsession to get the taste or the flavor of things from inside. When I was 20, I lived 4 or 5 months in Romania. It was under Ceausescu, and I believe that I have this need. I felt this philosophical responsibility, I would tell you, because I came from a communist family. I didn't have any illusions about the regimes in Eastern Europe, and I felt because I come from such a family and from such ideological background, I have some sort of a philosophical responsibility to taste life in the mutation, or in this terrible dictatorship that evolved in Eastern Europe.
You wrote, I think in the introduction to the Gaza book, it has always been my conviction that history is made more in the currents of ordinary life than it is by rulers and their ceremonies.
Yeah.
So you're implementing that, basically.
I guess, no, I mean, I referred there to why I was not interested in the coming of Abu Mazen to Gaza after he had 2 years, I don't know, one of the series of these feuds and disagreements that he had with Arafat, and then he came all of a sudden. So everybody was very interested in this, but for me it just looked like a boring ritual of people who think themselves at the top of, I don't know, of the Olympus. And I prefer to be with friends who made the own history.
I can't resist asking you this question, and that is because you come from a Marxist, communist tradition. So what is the relation of theory to observation and facts in your work? I mean, clearly you've headed, as you've already discussed, toward the notion of what is the real situation, what are people's lives really like, but how do you think about theory in the back of your mind?
I think it exists in the sense, I mean, I always see the class conflict. I always see class tensions. I don't even have to theorize about it. It's so self-evident. I think that's why I was very early on very critical of the Palestinian Authority, because I saw the way that they were creating new classes in all sorts of corrupted and corruptive ways in order to build up a stronghold which supports the Oslo process. So I saw this. At the same time, I saw the Israeli ongoing colonization very clearly. And I saw it was done in order to establish Israeli Jewish privileges in the area. But then because I'm very aware of the basic my theoretical inbuilt assumptions. I mean, I cannot even help it. It's not that I'm a scholar in Marxism. I'm not. I was very careful to be to collect a lot of information. And I was very careful when people started telling me about Arafat's people starting to accumulate their capital in the occupied territories, while most of the people went through a process of impoverishment. I was very careful and didn't immediately write about it, because I felt because I'm inclined to believe this, I have to collect more information. So in a sense, I'm sometimes more careful about it, and because I'm aware of it.
Tell me a little about your craft as a writer. Your pieces are beautifully written. They are comprehensive in their detail. There's an eye for things that people ignore. How do you do this? How did you come to do it so well?
Thank you. That's not the basic requirement of journalism, so it is. But well, I guess that's my. I think sometimes I see as if I see a film, and then I feel I have to describe the film in words. So I want, if I were a filmmaker, that's how I would have done it with pictures. So that's my way. Then also, of course, I don't only write features, I write op-eds. And I know that I have to give up the analysis, to expose the analysis, but I prefer to expose it through examples and through examples from daily life, and not to burden with slogans. I'm trying to avoid slogans as much as possible, because I live in a society, both Israeli and Palestinian, that is really overcrowded with slogans and copyright, you know, one sentence exclamations, and I'm appalled by it.
And it sounds like you keep many stories in your mind at one time and choose when you actually write it up and publish it. So you're not driven by the headlines as you make, as many journalists are.
I don't need to, because I don't cover now daily news.
Yeah.
So I know some things are structural, and they might not get the first headline news or headlines, but they are structural, and they are it's a certain development within Israeli policy or within Palestinian tactics. So I pay attention to this much more to what seems to catch the attention of everybody at a certain moment and then dies after 2-3 days.
Let's talk now a little about the Israeli occupation. You have delineated in an essay in Palestinian Studies the structure of Israeli rule. Explain it to us. What are the byproducts of the strategy that Israel is employing to control the territories?
Let me first say this, that occupation is not necessarily a military occupation. Occupation means when one people and one government, a foreign government, decides about the future and scope of development and chances of development of another people which has not elected this government. So this is, for me, this I came to understand what occupation is, especially in the years of Oslo, the Oslo process, where which everybody thought was the peace process, and I felt this ongoing and ever-intensifying Israeli policy of control over Palestinian life. Even though the army was not directly inside, was not inside Palestinian populated areas, and even though there were negotiations between Palestinian leaders and the Israeli government. So the two main manifestations of this control and Israeli persistent and successful attempt to dictate Palestinian future were these two means were it is twofold. One is the policy of colonization or of settlement, whereby Israel got hold of much more land within Gaza and the West Bank, also during the Oslo process, made sure that actually it created the infrastructure of a one state in the one country between the land and the river. So it was one infrastructure of very good highways, roads, and connecting settlements, remote settlements with Israeli mainland, establishing the same sewage system, water system, electric grid, education system, whatever, of Israel in these remote places in the occupied territories, but an infrastructure for Jews alone. Mm-hmm. Now, in between this infrastructure, this grid of roads and settlements, you had Palestinian enclaves, which were allotted sort of self-rule, but the self-rule was in itself very limited, because you could not expand in your natural reserve and territorial reserve, because this was taken by the Israelis in the time of the peace process, so-called peace process. So this was one. The second thing to control Palestinian development was through a new system introduced first in 1991, which was practically a pass system, like the one we knew in apartheid South Africa, which meant that Palestinians, their right for freedom of movement was taken from them, was not respected. In reverse to what had happened between 1967 to 1991, that in spite of the occupation, in spite of all kinds of attacks against Israelis by Palestinians during these previous years, they were granted freedom of movement in the whole country, with certain exceptions. Now, all of them were not granted, were allowed to move freely, except of a few categories, which were chosen by Israel in different times, and were granted this very limited freedom of movement. Now, with the years, this system has perfected. So it involves more and more people who need permits, and in smaller and smaller areas. If at the beginning you needed a permit, a travel permit, from Gaza to Israel or from Gaza to the West Bank and vice versa, you now need a permit to go from one city in the West Bank to another city in the West Bank. In certain areas in the West Bank and Gaza, people who live near settlements need permits to go out of their own area in special hours through special gates. So actually what Israel has been doing during the last 12 years is fragmentizing not only Palestinian territory, but Palestinian population into certain categories, which you characterize by their accessibility to the privilege of freedom of movement.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is that the reality, the actual lives of Palestinians, the actual rules that Israel is imposing is very different in some ways from the general perception, because all of this was happening at a time when the Oslo Accords seemed to be a peace process moving toward a final status in which Palestine would have its own state.
Exactly. It was a process which guaranteed that the final status would be a very enfeebled Palestinian political entity.
And we are, you are also saying that in the course of this process, Israel, through the, in a sense, through the processes of its rule, was creating facts, creating realities that in a way really narrowly limited the future place where the Palestinian state could be.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I guess talk a little about, you say, and I think what's very interesting is your writing, you actually focus on time and space in this process. And if I can quote from you, say, time and space together make room in one's world, not only materially to accomplish one's tasks and activities, but at the level of the spirit, enabling both the individual and the community to breathe, to develop, to prosper, to create. Space in the occupied territories has been gradually but ruthlessly encroached upon for more than 30 years as more and more land has been expropriated. That's what you just described. You know, this is a kind of a theoretical statement. Give us an example in everyday life. I think I read recently a column of yours about children trying to get through the fence. Tell us a story like that, because I think what's really interesting, if I can sermonize here, is when we deal with these issues from afar, or maybe even in Israel, we don't think about their implications for everyday life. But you are addressing that.
Of course, I'll give you I'll share with you again this story of a village called Jbara. It found itself locked between the new built fence that Israel, the security fence, and the former Green Line. And
this fence, we should explain, is a fence that Israel is building,
yes,
allegedly for security purposes, exactly, to separate the Palestinians from the Israelis.
Exactly, and to prevent from terrorists, from suicide bombers infiltrating into Israel. But the fence is not built along the Green Line, along the border of 67, but it's built in many places deep into Palestinian territory in order to incorporate Israeli settlements. So actually it is upgrading the former border, and it is actually expropriating land from Palestinian community, and it locks in people. So people in these areas are not allowed to go freely to Israel and cannot go freely to the Palestinian territory. So in this village, only 300 people. You have 100 children studying in a nearby village, which is actually the mother village of this little village.
So the students have to go to this other village for school?
Through the fence.
Through the fence.
The fence has a gate. So sometimes it is being opened, sometimes it is not being opened. Now there are some teachers teaching in a nearby Palestinian city called Tulkarem. So they have to cross from another place through an Israeli checkpoint with soldiers. Sometimes they're let through, sometimes they're not let through. Now the villagers need to have a special identity card, additional to what they have, which is the authorization, Israeli authorization for them to live where they live. This is a very new issue. Because they live in this area, which was declared closed area, but only to Palestinians. Jews can go there and live there, but Palestinians cannot. Only those who live there are allowed to stay, provided they get this authorization from the Israeli authorities, Israeli military. Now, a few have already were already told that they are not allowed to stay there because some of them were politically active years ago and were in Israeli jails or so on and so forth. But this is their land, this is their home, this is their family, and now they are actually supposed to leave it. And this is something which is not. It happened in a different scale, so far larger scale in Gaza Strip. The same thing. You have areas in the Gaza Strip where people cannot need to go through fences and through gates twice a day, once a day. Sometimes not, sometimes yes. They cannot go with their cars. They're not allowed to bring in things. They cannot ship. They cannot market their agricultural products. So many people have been pushed to leave these areas which are not by surprise the only vacant areas in the Gaza Strip, and where there are some of the big settlements situated. So you see it's a policy in the name of security which forces many people, to leave their own land and own homes if they want to conduct some decent life. And if they insist on staying there, they are doomed to impoverished life and pushed into charity life. They are subjects of charity, and they are not living of their own work.
And so this combination of the past system and of the infrastructure to support the Israeli settlements leads to everyday problems, so that for an Israeli to travel on the highways that were built for the Israeli settlements, a trip could take, hypothetically, 30 minutes on a freeway like we have in the Bay Area. Yeah. But on the other hand, a Palestinian who's not entitled to go on these roads, the same trip could take several hours.
Yes, or he could not leave at all.
Yeah.
So what I call it is not only the robbery of land, but you have a robbery of time. Mm-hmm. So Palestinians' time has been robbed in the last 13 years, because you have to wait for a permit and you don't get it, then you have to wait again, then you waste time waiting at a checkpoint, then you waste time in submitting another request for a permit, then you waste time trying to go in all kind of small dangerous bypass roads. And time is a means of production. Time is so precious for one's development. Internal development, community development, and this has been robbed by the past system. This very important means of life of every person, not just Palestinian, has been robbed of them. And sometimes I think it's more precious than land, because land you can get back, or some one way or the other. The lost time you will never get back. And
it must lead to a kind of a sense of helplessness, of frustration that eats away at the soul, I guess, is the only way to...
It's, total strangulation. And the thing is that people are not even that aware of how huge this loss of time is. Mm-hmm. But I see how because of this loss of time and loss of space, because they don't have freedom of movement, people have lowered their fan of expectations. Mm-hmm. They are not expecting much of their lives, because they know that they will be disappointed. You cannot plan and go to see friends. And I'm even talking about this before these terrible times of armed clashes between Israelis and Israeli assaults against Palestinians. People have lowered so much their expectations of themselves, and they restrict themselves to their narrow surrounding: family, work, home, family, work, home. Nothing more than that. You don't even go in Gaza now. Even the sea, half of the shore is blocked for Palestinians. You live 400 meters away from the shore, and you can't reach the sea, because there are settlements, and the security of the settlements comes first.
Help us understand how Israel came to adopt this strategy. I think in your readings I get the sense that these were ad hoc decisions initially with regard to control that have in essence turned into something else.
Yeah, it's something that I'm always asking myself, to what extent it had been a master plan from the start. I'm still, oscillating between the two possibilities, or how much it was taken in '91 as an ad hoc policy, meant especially to contain the first Intifada. Because in '91 the first Intifada came to some sort of a standstill in terms of Palestinian measures and ability to continue a mass, or inability to continue a mass uprising. And the Israeli repression came to a standstill, because at that time Israel acknowledged the status of its status in humanitarian terms of an occupying power. So it had responsibility on the welfare of the civilian population. That's why it could not bomb Palestinians. It could not repress their uprising by dropping one-ton bombs on civilian areas, or by killing every day 5, 6, 7 people. So it had to confine to bureaucratic, logistic means. And the pass system was a sort of such bureaucratic means. It tried to contain Palestinian uprising from spilling over into Israel proper. And also I think that it allowed Israel much more control, because people were subject to all these extra documents, and then you can control people's movements, and then you contain their activities. But with time, I think, and especially with the Oslo years, they understood how they could control economical life, how they could actually lead what I see now, and there are economists who say the same, lead this sort of war, economical war of attrition vis-à-vis the Palestinian Authority, and thus enforce them to have all kind of, to accept all kind of concessions during the talks, during the negotiations about the interim status and then the final status. Then I think it evolved, I don't know at what stage, I mean, I think very early on, it has evolved as a means to achieve demographic separation, not geographic separation, not political separation, but demographic separation, which means that Israel is still in control all over the territory where two peoples live, but it is separating the two peoples. And then it separates, but for the sake of one people, of one demographic group.
Let's talk a little now about the suicide bombers, because in this recent phase, the last couple of years of the second Intifada, this has become a series of events that have shattered our ability to actually understand what is going on in that part of the world, and has obviously been tied to the U.S. policy and war against terrorism. And links have been made, whether they are justified or not. How do you account, or let's put it this way, help us understand how suicide bombers emerged in this conflict on the Palestinian side?
You know, the first suicide bombings which occurred in Palestinian territory, not in Israel, were in '93. This was 10 years after the first suicide bombings in Lebanon, which means for 10 years Palestinians, who are mostly Muslims, did not think of endorsing such a way. Their fight was always based on hope for life, not for death. Now, '93 is 2 years after the imposition of the pass system and of the closure policy. I think it has to do this kind of you feel this sort of impotence, this terrible sort of impotence that Palestinians felt in the times when their space was reduced. And this was only '93, and this was 3 or 4 attempts inside the occupied territories, Gaza and the West Bank. And this was against mostly military targets and settlers, but who are seen by Palestinians as military, not as civilians. But the first suicide bombings inside Israel were in '94, and these were 1 month or so, or 2 months after the murder conducted by a Jewish American physician or doctor in Me'arat HaMachpelah, in Hebron, where he killed 29 Muslim worshippers in their holy place. So this was a revenge one time, and then the revenge started, it started to be emulated by Hamas and by Jihad against Israel, always saying that this is retaliation against Israeli actions and killings of civilians. But it had a clear political motive on the part of Hamas, and this was to foil the Oslo agreements or to push to a corner the Palestinian Authority. I have no, I mean, this is, I think, is obvious. So it had a political motive, and especially internal political motive. The struggle within the Palestinian Authority inside.
So that the factions among within the Palestinian leadership, in their competition with each other for popular support, see this as a tool.
It was a tool then,
yeah,
by Hamas.
Yes.
In this intifada, it became a tool in the competition between everybody. So they are using, these factions are using people's disgust with life, total loss of hope, the need for revenge because so many Palestinian civilians had been killed during the last 3 years, almost unnoticed by the entire world. So they feel this need to take revenge, and they feel this need to get out, even for a moment, from their captivated and very limited space vis-à-vis Israeli military technology, and to be omnipotent even for one moment. Mm-hmm. So they're ready to die for this, because they don't see any point in living. But then the factions are using this readiness, not because they strategize and they think that this will bring them closer to independence, but because they compete with each other on their popularity within the Palestinian population.
Mm-hmm. So let's broaden our understanding of this. So what you have is a hypothetical person whose family's land is taken away, or who loses a relative,
or who sees so much blood around him.
Right. Yeah. Who is led to kind of unbelievable depression and frustration, and becomes a target of opportunity for factions among the Palestinian leadership who want to use him in this way, to strike back at Israel.
Very often they don't have to work hard to recruit him or her.
Yeah.
Very often such people voluntarily look for someone and tell, we would like to make a suicide attack. Yeah. So they come themselves very often.
So, it's from our side of the water, it's hard to understand what would lead a person to take this act, and one is not sure as to whether they are motivated by religion, by going to heaven. Talk a little about that.
For me, as a secular person, it's also very difficult to, on the one hand, to believe or to understand when people do talk about heaven. So I need the help of my Palestinian friends and acquaintances who might not be very secular, but not very religious. They say, most of them say that going to heaven, or the religious motivations of being shaheed, being martyr, and getting, that's why, eternal life in heaven, these are not the main motivations. They only come last, or they are being adopted because it is accepted as the norm. The real motivations are those personal community ones, of not personal in the sense that one's life is a total wreck. No, we see that many of those who went to explode themselves had careers, or started to have careers, were not coming from the poorest families, enrolled into universities. So it's not people who were really a total loss in Western in norms, or even Palestinian norms. So they felt they represent the society in its despair. And they want to do something, some use of this despair, revenge. Mm-hmm. So it is a very delicate interplay here between the personal despair, but not immediate despair, and the political community despair. Then I think that many of them got strength by becoming more observant, by going to the mosque, by praying 5 times a day, by reading Quran over and over again. It's only then. Some of them I know started with the Quran at the beginning of the Intifada, when they saw so much bloodshed, so many of their neighbors and friends and relatives getting killed, civilians getting killed by Israeli soldiers. So they found compensation and solace with reading the Quran. So it strengthened them. But this was not the motivation. It was maybe the support. At the same time, you know, I spoke, as I told yesterday in my lecture, I did speak to one person from Hamas, who eventually was killed, not in a suicide attack. He was always going out vis-a-vis Israeli military tanks and soldiers, and eventually he was killed in one of those battles. He with his gun and invading tanks in his neighborhood. And we had talked a year before he was killed. And he saw himself as a candidate for suicide, because this was suicide. To fight against the Israeli army is almost suicide, because the proportions are such that you are always getting killed. And he didn't mention religious motivations at all, only the national ones, only the thing how many of his friends got killed. And he was a very educated person, and also very religious, theoretically religious. And he didn't use the religion as the first motivation for him at all. It gave him support, but not motivation.
We've talked about the Israeli policies of occupation, and now the response on the Palestinian side from some parts of the Palestinian community with the use of suicide bombers. In both of these cases, there seems, that is on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, there seems to be a failure of leadership, of a kind of responsible leadership that sees both the implications of policies and the dynamic of this situation. Let's look at both sides, and I want to ask you about, first on the Israeli side, it seems to be the case that even labor governments who initiated and tried to implement the Oslo process continued to build settlements, and that was a real failure of leadership. Do you agree with it?
Not at all. Not at all.
You don't agree?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Then you say failure because you assume that what their main goal was to have peace with the Palestinians, and just peace with the Palestinians. Yeah. I think that their main goal was to guarantee a stronger Israel, bigger Israel, and an enfeebled Palestinian political entity. And they were very successful. So it's a very responsible leadership if you think that this was their main goal.
So that all sides in the Israeli, or most all the sides in the Israeli debate are really committed to enlarging the size of Israel through settlements?
I think so. I think that this has been made clear during the Oslo process, especially, not before. Because before you could always say security, bargaining chip, whatever. But during the Oslo times, when everybody expected Israel to freeze all settlements, no, it was only expanded. And since Rabin, all through governments. So they were very successful. It's not a failure of leadership.
So then
it's a failure of Israeli constituencies that did not support these policies. But let themselves believe that their leadership is going towards peace.
Okay, and why? So why did these constituencies then fail in seeing what was going on and try to build a political coalition to oppose that?
Yeah, I guess that many people wanted to believe that it is possible to break the spell of conflict. And I think that people were very optimistic with the Oslo process. They thought that demands of years for two-state solution and talk with the Palestinians and recognition of the Palestinian people, etc., were coming true under Labour. And they just felt, oh, we were right all these years, and now there is a government which acknowledges we were right. Mm-hmm. So they paid very little attention to the reality on the ground. So I think on part you can explain it psychologically, not attributing bad motivations to these people. But others saw that peace was possible with settlements. Until 1991, we were made to believe that peace was not possible with settlements. Mm-hmm. Then with the Oslo process, after Arafat actually signed an accord where Israel is not being demanded to stop all settlement activity. Mm-hmm. So Israelis saw that peace with settlements was possible. So maybe Palestinians are satisfied with it. And after all, this settlement activity was beneficial for many segments of Israeli society. So I think this is why these constituencies failed to understand the discrepancy between the promise of stability and normal life in a state and the reality of permanent colonization.
Let's talk about the Palestinian leadership then. How do we account for their failure? And I hear you having said two things. One is that important parts of that leadership sold out to the Israelis in the Oslo process. That's my word, not your word, but compromise themselves, mm-hmm. Creating a class system almost among that leadership. And then secondly, I think I've heard you say that they have failed by the abuse of their own people, especially in the case of the suicide bombers, where they see them as tools for jockeying for position vis-a-vis the other factions.
It's not true about the suicide bombings. I don't think that the Palestinian leadership sent suicide bombers. Yeah. It maybe did not dare to stop it on time in this intifada, but it did not use the suicide bombers. It's the factions, and not the factions, some of them in opposition to the leadership, and some Fatah groupings, but which had loose connection with Arafat. So it's not the failure, but it is true that it's on the vis-a-vis Israel, it was a failure to correctly analyze Israeli motivations and to conduct better strategy of negotiation. I think it's partly the naivete of this Palestinian leadership, this also human need to see a change. I do believe, in spite of all what is said in Israeli and American propaganda, that they didn't intend to have peace with Israel. Let's not forget they were the weaker party. And I think that they were very sincere in their readiness for a two-state solution as a final status solution. But they failed to learn Israeli methods. Arafat's people didn't consult with people inside the occupied territories who had known Israelis better. They didn't know when they signed on the declarations of principles, they didn't even know how a settlement looked like. They thought it was military, distant positions, so that's why they did not bother to insist on it. Then they were not sold out so much as they let themselves be pampered by Israeli methods, very colonialist methods of pampering an elite with all sorts of privileges, especially privileges of freedom of movement, which allowed the Palestinian Authority to build up a sort of entourage which benefited economically from the process, and that's why it gave its political support to the process, participated in the political negotiations. So what you had, people who were economically dependent on the Israelis because of the privileges endowed to them by the Israelis, were also conducting the political negotiations with the Israelis about how big the settlements will be, how quickly the Israeli withdrawal redeployment will be, and how big the settlements will be or not be. So this was a catch here. which the byproduct is what you feel being sold out. But I don't think it was intentional. And many of them did believe that if they serve Israeli security demands for some time, they are guaranteeing the future and the stability of a Palestinian society. This is it. Now, class society, it has always been. Palestinian has always been class society. But the Palestinian Authority, internally, it had the responsibility for the welfare of the people. Now, instead of dedicating and developing this, the development of human beings inside, it invested a lot in all kind of symbolic aspects of life, which serve the grandeur of the authority. It allocated much of its budget to security organizations, multiply security organizations because Arafat needs this multiplicity in order to control. They did not develop enough health system, education system, did not see the person, the human beings, in order to use their own opportunities to develop. I think this was their main failure, and it stems out from the fact that they were not really elected. They came from outside. They were very indifferent to the people. They come from very undemocratic traditions, and this was a major failure. I think that if they cared more for their people and were more attentive to people's demands internally, they would have been stronger vis-à-vis Israel in the negotiation table.
What is the role you think that you as a writer can play in elevating consciousness of these dynamics, and in what way does that in the long term to contribute to a change in the situation?
Sometimes I think that I'm only writing for the archives. That in 5-10 years people will say, oh, she wrote so-and-so. I mean, it's... look, I didn't have influence. It's... I've been writing about, discrepancy between the reality and facts on the ground during the Oslo period. I've been writing extensively in my paper and then my book. People read me, but somehow it did not sink in. People did not, most of the people, I could say, did not get the message, because it's not for one writer to change things. You need a movement, you need a social movement, certain activity in the street of people who voice out clearly, and then this interplay between voices in the media and voices outside in the streets, in social activities, can make some sort of a change, or can be heard. When you are one voice, then I was considered a radical, extremist, pessimist, I don't know what.
Cassandra?
Yeah, Cassandra. No, Cassandra can be joy killer, joy killer.
Yeah.
I'm always spoiling the party.
Yeah.
So I was told by my editors sometimes, oh, everybody is talking about how Gazans are happy, but you only tell us about pass system and travel permits and all this. So why do you, I was even told, not by, but somebody, that I don't have perspective because I live in Gaza. So it's a new definition of journalism. So no, I don't think I made, on the contrary, I mean, I'm only very frustrated because I voiced so many clear and very logical voices among Palestinians, which warned Israelis about the coming explosion if Israel continues this policy of pushing into a surrender agreement, a surrender arrangement. And
so one final question: what is your advice to students who are interested in this region and want to prepare for some future that might involve a relationship with that region, but also people in other communities that have an interest in the region that have to view events there from afar, and many of whom may not read your writing on a regular basis, and actually probably don't, and are driven in their understanding by what they read in the headlines in the English-speaking press, which is maybe less than adequate in describing the real situation there. Advice to them.
Well, first to read other things, then
yeah, good. Read Haaretz online.
No,
Haaretz
not only. Okay, there are all kind of also all kind of less. All kind of messages, email. Not everything is always accurate, but they have to be very skeptical about what they read first, and then always to meet people with the region, and maybe try to see Al Jazeera. I mean, things which are not only Western, from a Western point of view, news. This is one. Then to remember, and I think it's true about every place, that to be very skeptical about official versions, very skeptical. I think that power, any power, has to be suspected everywhere and has to be monitored. And I think this is the main task of journalism. So they have to look for those kind of writings which monitor power, not and which describe the situations not from the eyes of the ruler only.
And I get the sense that you really think that, and believe both in word and in deed, that the truth emerges from sort of really understanding, describing, and being immersed in the reality that you're writing about.
Yeah, I believe that what I've been describing is the truth, that I don't believe that it makes much change and much influence. I mean, it does not preach to the non-converted. It does not reach the non-converted. It reaches the converted. But still, I believe this is true, what I've been writing.
Amira, on that note, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come to the Berkeley campus, but also being a guest today on our program. Thank you very much.
And thank you for an interesting talk.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.